short account of the life of Father John Nepomucene Neumann, priest of the Congregation of the Most Holy Redeemer and Bishop-elect of Philadelphia in North America. My parents, Philip Neumann from Obernburg in Lower Franconia, Bavaria, and Agnes Liebes had 6 children. The 2 oldest, Catherine and Veronica, both married widowers. I was the 6th third child, born on Good Friday in the year of our Lord, 1811, and baptized the same day in the town church of St. James the Greater. My godfather, John Marek, mayor of the town, named me John Nepomucene, in honor of the glorious patron of Bohemia. The 4th child is my sister Joan, who entered the Sisters of St. Charles in Prague after I left for America. She was the first novice to join the order after it was brought here from Nancy and Lorraine, known as Sister Caroline. She is at present superior of the hospital in Budweis. The next to the youngest, my sister Louise, is still at home taking care of our aged father, who, since the death of our mother 3 or 4 years ago, could not manage the large household alone. Furthermore, she has already arranged for living accommodations with the Sisters of St. Charles and will undoubtedly pursue her holy vocation as soon as her parental duty allows. The youngest of us, Brother Wenceslaus, learned our father's trade of stocking weaving. Later, he followed me to America. Since I came to America, besides my mother, my sister Veronica has died, and also the husband of my sister Catherine. Since Catherine, along with her son, has a goodly income, we, the other brothers and sisters, agreed to give up our inheritance in favor of our father while he was living, and after his death for a hospital for the town of Prakotets. Because of its size, the adjoining gardens and fields, the family house will be well suited for this. There will be no difficulty in giving this over to the Sisters of St. Charles. We were brought up in the old-fashioned school. Our parents were both deeply Christian, while our father from morning to night supervised the EP apprentices and workers, of which there were at times 5 or 6 in the house. Our mother never missed a day hearing Mass. She always took with her one or the other of the children who was not yet in school. She went to Holy Communion often and fasted not only on the fast days of the church, but at other times as well. My father, however, did not approve of this. In my case, there was needed at times the promise of a penny or something similar to bring me to Mass, Rosary, and Stations of the Cross. This was the occasion for one of my companions to say to his mother, who called his attention to my zeal in going to church, "Give me a penny every day, and I will be like him." On All Saints' Nov. 1, 1818, I began going to 16, our village school. Since the Lord gave me a good memory, I was always one of the first for the 6 years. However, the fact that my father always held one or the other of the town offices may have had some influence on the teacher. During these years, I had acquired from my father, who was a great lover of books, a decided passion for reading. As a result, the time that others spent in sports or bird catching, I spent in reading all the books I could get hold of. This is the reason why my mother often called me the little bookworm. When I was 7, I began to go to confession, and I was confirmed in the summer of 1819 by the Bishop of Budweis. People could not remember when a bishop had come to our remote mountain village. This is why the crowd of people and the celebration were beyond description and remained so vivid in my memory that since then I have had not the least trouble recalling the smallest details. About the day of my first Holy Communion, I can recall nothing, for in Bohemia it is not the custom to celebrate First Holy Communions as solemnly as in other countries. If I recall rightly, I was not yet 10 when I was thoroughly familiar with the large catechism and was also admitted then to First Holy Communion along with the other older First Communicants. After that, we all went every 3 months. I cannot say that I felt a decided inclination for the priesthood when I was a child. I had, of course, a little altar made of lead and served Mass almost every day. However, my idea of the priesthood was so exalted that it seemed beyond my reach. We had an old servant in the house, one who was strict in her observance of fasting. One day when, in keeping with the family practice, I said the prayers before meals out loud, and through forgetfulness made a Latin cross instead of the 3 crosses, one each on the forehead, mouth, and breast, she said, "See, our little John is going to be a priest." My mother spoke of this incident on various occasions because she hoped that I would one day be a priest. However, the thought came to me repeatedly later on, especially when our other school companions made up their minds regarding further studies and, as was the custom with us, first took lessons in Latin for a year or 2 from our catechist. I too was asked about this and my parents agreed to this at once. And so the last 2 years of school, 1822 to 1823, I went every night with 8 or 10 others to the catechist to learn the rudiments of Latin. On All Saints, 1823, I went with about 20 others from our town to Budweis for study at the gymnasium under the Pietist fathers. Since I was anxious not to cause my parents unnecessary expenses, I took a room with board with 3 others. Both were very cheap and cost no more than $16 for the 10 months. Had very little to learn because the catechist at home had taught us so much in the few hours each week that, with little preparation, we could have been admitted at once into the 3rd year. However, that was not permitted us. I was accused home to fill up the many idle hours and days with nothing else but the reading of all sorts of books that I could get my hands on, without thinking of being selective. At times I gladly went out to play or went for a walk with students from back home, but this happened only seldom. The 2 elderly people with whom I lived were very good Christians, but they had no control over us. Moreover, since we got a professor who, because of his advanced age and easygoing ways, was also given to drink, we did not make progress in our studies. Actually, I even forgot a great deal of what I had formerly known. In our 3rd year, this unfortunate priest appeared drunk at the examinations in the presence of the headmaster and was dismissed. Shortly after that, he shot himself to death. H's successor was just as learned, and he was strict. In half a year, he wanted to cover again the subjects of the past 2.5 years. Considering the lazy ways we had taken on under his predecessor, this was too much for most of the students. As a result, many dropped out. I was even more dissatisfied with the religion professor, who was dryness and dullness personified. He had an obsession for every word, and I did not have a good word-for-word memory. As a result, to me, the 2 classes in religion were most boring. We went to confession every 3 months. As far as I can recall, it was always a truly serious matter with me to receive the holy sacraments properly, for the first instruction that I received in my hometown and the recollection of the piety in my family home kept me from the pitfalls in which most of my school companions were trapped. At the end of the school year 1827, I was very disgusted with my studies, and during the vacation I even thought about giving them up. In this situation, I readily let my mother and my deceased sister Veronica talk me into continuing them. Actually, the study of the humanities was much more to my liking, because we had a professor who, although stricter than the other, nevertheless manifested a certain amount of condescension towards us. During the 2 years of philosophy Nov. 1, 1829 Sept. 7, 1831, many changes took place in me. We were a group of 8 or 10 students who showed a strong attraction for various areas of study. We 32 spent all our free hours and entire recreation days sharing with one another what each one had found out in his own specialty. Added to this, there was the good and blameless conduct of our professors, the revered Cistercians, who were in charge of the Institute of Philosophy. With them, everyone felt a very friendly welcome and complete satisfaction, despite the fact that they were mercilessly strict when they discovered deceit or bad will. In those 2 years, I avidly followed my bent for the natural sciences, botany and biology, geography, physics, geology, astronomy. And I applied myself with the greatest enthusiasm to algebra, geometry and trigonometry, subjects that formerly were not to my liking. When the time came, at the end of the philosophy course, for me to decide either for theology or law or medicine, I felt more of an attraction for the latter. This was all the more so because out of 80 or 90 applicants for theology, only 20 were to be accepted. For this, along with the best scholastic transcript, recommendations were also required, and I wanted to have nothing to do with them. In this uncertainty about the choice of a prof scion, I came home in the autumn vacation of 1831 and found that my father was not against letting me study medicine in Prague, even though the expenses involved were great. My mother was not too happy with this. Even though I pointed out to her that I did not know anyone who would back my request for admission into the Institute for the Study of Theology, everyone studied there without paying tuition. Nevertheless, she thought that I should give it a try. I then wrote a letter of application and sent it to Budweis by a special messenger to the bishop's consistory, and shortly after that I received the letter of acceptance into the Budweis Theological Seminary. From that moment on, I never gave another thought to medicine, and I also practically gave up completely the study of physics and astronomy, on which I preferred to spend time, and this without any great difficulty. The studies pursued up to the present had at least this good result, that I had not wasted my time on trivialities, and that my mind was better prepared for the serious study of theology. During the philosophy years, I also went to church. Even on weekdays, actually, most of my companions at that time did likewise. On the Feast of All Saints, 1831, I began the study of theology. At that time, because of the lack of space in the diocesan seminary, Only those in the last 2 years were allowed to live in. Consequently, I was an extern. I studied a more sacred scripture, Old Testament, Hebrew, and church history. I did this to my own personal satisfaction, and also to the satisfaction of my professors, who were diocesan priests, and who, with the exception of the professor of church history and canon law, who was more of a Josephinist, had a good spirit and 8th grade ease, taught us in a short time a great deal of useful material. At the end of the first year of theology, I was one of the few who were to receive tonsure and the 4 minor orders. This actually took place on July 21st, 1832. In the second year of theology, we had the New Testament in Latin and Greek together with exegesis and canon law. What appealed to me most were the letters of the Apostle St. Paul, which the professor knew how to explain very well. About this time, I began to read the reports of the Leopoldine Society, especially the letters of Father Barragan and 46 other missionaries among the Germans in North America. This is how there arose in one of my fellow students, Adalbert Schmidt, and in myself on the occasion of a walk along the Moldau River, the determination to devote ourselves to North America as soon as we acquired some experience after ordination. 2 or 3 of our fellow students, whom we invited to join us, marveled at our decision, but they did not want to promise anything. Obviously, it was not their vocation. From that moment on, my resolution was so strong and lively that I could no longer think of anything else. We had talks on how to carry out our project. We thought it would be better for me to try to obtain from the Bishop of Budweis the recently vacated foundation scholarship at the University of Prague for a theologian from the Budweis Seminary. We did this in the hope of easily learning French and English there, because we thought that the knowledge of these languages was much more important than is actually the case. The bishop granted my request, but I found myself very much disappointed. I had hardly gone to the French classes at the Clementinum for a few days or weeks when an order came from the Archbishop that no seminarian was to attend these classes. As for English, I could learn even less, because that language was not taught at the university then. At Prague, I was likewise displeased with the professors of dogmatic and moral theology, as well as of pastoral theology. The first was more against the Pope than for him, but he raised so many ridiculous difficulties that he was too little regarded to do any harm. The second was far too philosophical for a single one of us to understand him. The third was an out-and-out Josephinist. It cost me a great deal of effort and self-conquest to study subjects and opinions, the foolishness of which I had already learned to see through. It is a pity that institutions like this, so much more is done to keep up the appearance of learning than to spread good Catholic and useful knowledge. I was obviously genuinely happy when I could return to Budweis in August 1835, after having passed the examination. Meanwhile, the Bishop of Philadelphia, AFR, Ansis P. Atrick Kenrick, the present Archbishop of Baltimore, empowered Dr. Rass, the rector of the Strasbourg Seminary, now Bishop of Strasbourg, to accept young priests, or, even better, theologians for his diocese. The latter wrote to a very saintly priest, who was vicar of the Budweis Cathedral, about the possibility of getting some of them from Bohemia. Through a special disposition of divine providence, this turned out to be the one Father Hermann Dictiel, who brought the order of the Sisters of St. Charles of Nancy to Bohemia. He also happened to be the confessor of my friend Albert Schmidt, and knew about our proposal to go to America. Aside from 3 or 4 of our fellow students and him, no one knew about this. He was very happy to discover in us the first 2 that he found ready to go to America. Furthermore, on his trip to France to bring 3 postulants to Nancy to the above-mentioned sisters, he became acquainted with the genuinely Catholic Paris Foreign Mission Society. And since he was a man who had in abundance the mind and the courage to take in big plans and carry them through, he thought about setting up a similar institute in Austria. The request to Dr. Rass mentioned above, and our own decision, seemed to be signs that his plan would be feasible. Since the bishop, who was over 80, was sick, and since for 4 or 5 months there was no prospect that he would hold an ordination, he was all in favor of the 2 of us being ready to take off as soon as possible. His plan, however, met with no approval at all, not only from the bishop but from the cathedral chapter as well. The Leopoldine Society, from which we requested the necessary traveling expenses, refused because they said that the Bishop of Philadelphia should have requested it for us, and not we ourselves. Despite such bad prospects, the vicar of the cathedral arranged for the bishop to communicate our proposal to many of the pastors and allow them to take up a collection among the priests of the diocese. However, because there was no mention of a recommendation, or even of only a wish on his part, the amount Gath eared was scarcely sufficient to cover traveling expenses for one. It was then decided that I should set out by myself. Moreover, since Dr. Rass had promised each missionary going to America 400 to 500 francs as a supplement to the traveling expenses, all difficulties seemed settled. After many requests and letters, the passport finally came. Good for 3 years. My father gave his consent reluctantly. My mother, by contrast, seemed pleased. I likewise found all encouragement possible from the clergy of our town, and especially the dean. After I made a pilgrimage to Nepomuc, the birthplace of my patron saint, I left my hometown on February 8, 1836, without taking a formal farewell. The necessary preparations for travel kept me in Budweis several more days. On the 13th, after receiving the bishop's blessing, I set out for Linz. My friend Adalbert Schmidt accompanied me to the outskirts of his hometown, which was on my way. On our route through the Bohemian forest, the snow was 14 or 15 feet high. In Linz, I stayed at the diocesan seminary and was honored by Bishop Ziegler with a Latin address and a sumptuous meal. At that time, a missionary, even one in CSPE, was regarded as something unusual that was not an everyday event. Provided with letters of recommendation, I left Linz in the evening of February 18th for Munich. On the way, we passed through Altötting. However, since it was dark, I could hardly make out the celebrated pilgrimage church. In Munich, I stayed with my cousin, Philip Jansen, who is a member of the Royal Hartsheer Bodyguard. When I went to Dr. Phillips, the professor, I met Father Henny, the Vicar General of Cincinnati and present Bishop of Milwaukee. He gave me the strange news that the Bishop of Philadelphia had just revoked the authorization he gave Dr. Rass to accept missionaries for his diocese, and that, as a result, I had no hope of being accepted by him. Professor Phillips volunteered to write to Bishop Brut of Vincennes, who had recently passed through Munich on his way to Rome, and ask if he would be willing to receive me into his diocese. I was to remain in Strasbourg until the answer arrived. In Augsburg, where I arrived on the 21st of February, I received a most hospitable welcome from Dean Fischert of the Cathedral Chapter and his chaplain, Dr. Schmidt. The latter joined the Jesuits at Freiburg later on. When I came to Strasbourg at the end of February, Dr. Rass also told me that I could not go to Philadelphia, that he would write to Bishop Dubois of New York about accepting me because Bishop Brut probably would not be able to accept me. A more urgent bit of news was the fact that he had already given away to other missionaries from Alsace and Lorraine the traveling money that had been marked for me. Meanwhile, he promised to write a rich merchant in Paris on my behalf who, as a great friend of the missions, would undoubtedly see that I received a goodly subsidy. Since my traveling money was a source of concern for him, he advised me to go to Paris immediately and to wait there for the answer from Bishop Brut. Hence I left Strasbourg on March 3rd and visited the hospital of the Sisters of St. Charles and Nancy, where I also met 2 of the novices that Father Dictiel had brought there. I had known both of them in Budweis, and they were very happy to hear some news from faraway Bohemia. Here I also met a priest from Alsace who likewise wanted to go to America and who had written about this to Bishop Brut and planned to wait for the answer in Paris. I was very happy about this, because he was a very holy and zealous priest and spoke French fluently, while I, despite my good school report in French, had trouble now and then in understanding a word or in making myself understood. The 2 of us arrived in Paris 84, on the Saturday before Laitier Sunday. Despite all the testimonials and recommendations from Strasbourg, we were unable to find lodgings with the Sulpicians, and after many refusals we were finally received in the Foreign Missions Seminary on the condition that we pay the 20 francs for the monthly rent of the room. We had to take our meals in the guest house. The reason for all this discrimination towards us was the bad reputation that had befallen all German priests of that time because of the petition of the clergy of Baden and Württemberg for the abolition of celibacy. The rich merchant of Strasbourg was not to be found, and my traveling money had dwindled to about 200 francs. 89. Although no answer had as yet arrived from Bishop Brut, I started out on my journey with my 2 leather bags and big box full of books, a present from Dr. Rass, when I came to Messagerie Lafitte Co. To leave for Havre, my stagecoach had already left about 5 minutes earlier. To catch up with it, and so as not to lose the 24 francs already paid, I was advised to hire a hack to catch up with the stagecoach. However, I was too late, and the driver, to whom I had paid 5 francs, left me standing outside Paris on the road to Havre de Grace. I did not want to go back, and so, trusting my 2 good feet, in good spirits I marched along the way leading to the ocean, even though the sun had already set. It became darker by the minute, and to make matters worse, It began to rain steadily. As a result, I arrived at St. Germain by way of Nanterre, completely drenched from my night march, but not the least bit tired. Here I met a good old Frenchman who must have noticed my difficulty when, after 100 whats and 200 if you please, I got him to understand my predicament. He went to the office of Messagerie Lafitte, and shortly after that he helped me up the covered roof of the high stagecoach on which I came to Havre by way of Rouen behind the driver's seat, and sitting next to a Jew. I only had to pay the conductor a small amount. After my arrival in Havre on the 9th of March on my first trip to the harbor, I found at once the American three-master, the Europe, and Captain Drummond. With the help of an interpreter, I came to an agreement with him to take me to New York on the middle deck for 80 francs. Since I obviously had to provide my own food, for 56 more francs I bought potatoes, biscuits, salt, oil, butter, and ham, and finally a cooking pot, etc., and a straw mattress. On the 10th, my luggage that had been left behind in Paris arrived, and at the same time the news came from Father Schaeffer, my travel companion from Nancy to Paris, that he, but not I, was accepted by the Bishop of Vincennes. The same day I had my things brought on board, and I also lived there until we weighed anchor about 2 o'clock in the afternoon of April 20th and sailed out into the Channel. The ocean voyage lasted until Trinity Sunday, when we anchored at the New York quarantine. Nothing outstanding took place except that once, in a raging wind that hit the topmast, I was almost struck dead. It crashed on the very spot of the deck that I had left scarcely a minute earlier. Although the company aboard was not choice, mostly Protestants from the canton of Bern, and although we had a lot of contrary wind, this ocean voyage meant a great deal to me. Moreover, only a few times did I have an attack of seasickness, because we had no sick on board. We had no difficulty passing over to Long Island on Monday in a sloop and going to New York from there on the steamship Columbus. Bishop Dubois of New York was very happy over my arrival, for he was in great need of German priests. I lived in his house, and while I was waiting for ordination, Father Raffiner assigned me the task of preparing the children of the German parish for First Holy Communion. On the 19th of June in St. Patrick's Cathedral, Bishop Dubois ordained me sub-deacon on the 24th, the feast of St. John the Baptist, deacon, and on the 25th, priest. 106th to 26th, a Sunday, I celebrated the High Massachusetts in St. Nicholas Church on 2nd Street, NY, as my first Holy Massachusetts, and during it, I gave First Holy Communion to the children whom I had prepared. Even before my arrival, the bishop had selected me for Williamsville in Erie County, NY, and requested that I set out at once. On the journey, I said Mass on the feast of St. Peter and Paul, which was still a holy day of obligation at that time, in St. Mary's, Albany, and in the morning of the 4th of July arrived at Rochester, where, in keeping with the wishes of the bishop, I was to spend a few days. The old St. Joseph's Church was not yet ready 109 for divine service, and so I had to make use of my priestly faculties for the first time in St. Patrick's. I preached there twice on Sunday, heard confessions, and baptized, all this for the first time in America. On the 10th of July, Father Prost came to Rochester. The bishop had invited him to take over the German communities, but had not expected him so soon. I 112 remained another day with that zealous priest, because he wanted me to. He was the first Redemptorist with whom I had the opportunity to speak. On the 13th, I said Mass in Buffalo in the old frame St. Louis Church, where Father Pax had been for a year. Later, the same day, he brought me out to Williamsville, 10 miles north of Buffalo. From here, along with the Williamsville parish, I also took care of the parish in North Bush and a third in Lancaster, Cayuga for a whole year. I also began to visit the community in transit in Batavia, as well as a German settlement in Niagara County along the Erie Canal below Pendleton, since I had to fire the school teacher of Williamsville for bad conduct, and since the communities were not in a position to hire a new teacher because of the churches and school that were being built, and even more because of their poverty, I conducted school in Williamsville for 6 or 7 months, until a teacher was again installed. In my first fervor, I worked a bit too hard at that time and drew down upon myself repeated admonitions from Father Pax, since I was obliged, or rather expected, to pay my board in Williamsville and had a debt of $80. After a year, I changed my regular residence to North Bush, where I lived with a farmer in his log cabin for a year and a half. I lived there for nothing and was very highly regarded, but I also had to walk. every day almost a mile and a half through the muddy woods to the nearest church. In the summer of 1837, Bishop Du Bois came to my parishes on his episcopal visitation. He was accompanied by Father Prost. The latter would have liked very much to get the bishop to give over Buffalo and my parishes to the Congregation of the Most Holy Redeemer. To facilitate this project, he exhorted me often and at length to enter his congregation. His reasons were all very good and true, but they did not impress me because at that time I did not have a spark of a vocation. The bishop did not want to know or hear a thing about Father Prost's proposaland, so the latter gave up even the Rochester parish and went to Norwalk, Ohio. A few weeks previously, Father Hatcher also visited me in North Bush. And even though I had a great liking for him, as well as for Father Chaker Eert, whom I once met in Buffalo on a passing visit, I never got the thought of entering the congregation. I then received the invitation to go to Rochester and take care of that parish also until a priest was found. I was astounded at the tremendous amount of good that Father Prost had accomplished in such a short time. The fervor shown in making visits to the church, the frequent practice of confessions by men and young people, all of which he accomplished through the introduction of the fraternity of Mt. Carmel, made the most profound impression on me. Convinced of the good results of the fraternity, I wanted to introduce it into my parishes also, and I asked Father Prost for his advice. His answer was that he had the power to introduce it as a member of the Congregation of the Most Holy Redeemer, but that he could not impart the power to others. He ended his letter with a repeated explanation of the phrase, "Ve soli," woe to him who is alone. On the order of Bishop Du Bois, a certain Father Ludgen from Luxembourg took over Lancaster and Williamsville. However, this did not last long. A few days after his arrival, there came some derogatory letters about him. His preaching against ecclesiastical superiors and confession, etc., and even more, his association with women, resulted in his being suspended by the bishop after 4 or 5 weeks. Once again, I had to take over these fast-growing parishes. Meanwhile, my people in North Bush built me a little frame house next to the church, set up a little garden, and in this way made my living conditions much easier. Furthermore, this took place when, at the end of September 1838, my brother Wenceslaus came here and took upon himself the house duties, for which I had never hired anyone up until then. However, my duties increased daily because I now had to care for Sheldon also. After I made visits to Rochester every 2 or 3 months, Father Sandral settled there. About Easter 1840. I was taken by a very persistent and recurring fever and suffered from it for 3 months. After I was somewhat restored, it was recommended that I take a short trip, and so I went to Rochester to visit Father Sandral, whom I did not yet know. After staying with him 3 or 4 days, I returned to my mission. During that time, neither Father Sandral nor I spoke about entering the congregation, or even he thought about it. Rochester, but things would not go that way. This, as well as a natural, or rather supernatural, desire to live in a community of priests, where I would not have to be exposed alone to the 1,000 dangers of the world, made me suddenly resolve to request from Father Prost, who remained in Baltimore after the Provincial Council of 1840, admittance into the Congregation of the Most Holy Redeemer. I wrote to him that very day, in fact that very hour, Sept. 4. 1840, and I received from him the news of my AC septance in a letter of the 16th of September from Baltimore. Immediately after receiving the letter, I made my decision known to the administrator of the diocese, Bishop Hughes. I also asked him, along with his blessing, to provide the parish with one of our priests. After I waited 14 days, in vain, for an answer, he was away on visitation, but I did not know that. I made my travel preparations and left my stations, I believe. On the 8th or 9th of October, I left my brother Wenceslaus behind to gather up the few small possessions of mine scattered over the different missions, and then to follow me to Pittsburgh. In Buffalo, I waited until the 13th when, at 8 o'clock in the evening, I was able to procure standing room, not sitting room, or, much less, sleeping room on a small steamer that already had over 400 emigrants and passengers on board. A terrible storm came up about midnight, and the weak, overloaded boat could not master it. When, after a long, wretched night, we looked about us in the morning, we found that we were back again outside the Buffalo harbor. Without landing, the captain took on another load of coal, and as soon as the wind let up a bit, he sailed out again on the lake. This was still very rough, and instead of being in Erie at noon, by 2 o'clock we had only reached Dunkirk. Here the captain, without landing, again took on board a load of pit coal from boats that were passing by. in the night between OT. 14th and 15th, the storm broke out again when we were almost at Erie. Since the captain feared the shoals close by, he changed course, and about 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning we were again back at Dunkirk, where we had been 12 hours earlier. However, at daybreak the bad weather was over, and about 2 o'clock in the afternoon on the feast of St. Teresa Octi. 15th, we all landed in Erie. Since we left Buffalo, we had eaten nothing, for we never thought about taking provisions along because we presumed that we would have put the 90 miles behind us before daybreak. The incessant rain, the seasickness, etc., the complete lack of rest and sleep left us all completely drained. In Erie, I met Father Ivo Lavies, a Franciscan, who took care of the small German parish. I rested at his place for a day, and then in the evening of the 16th I departed for Pittsburgh on the stagecoach. I arrived there on the morning of the 18th and received a friendly welcome from Father Chen Hens, the superior of the house. Since it was a Sunday, I was invited to celebrate the High Massachusetts in the factory church. Father Sackert took care of the small missions out in the country. As Father Chen, 146 Hens, was called to Baltimore on All Saints, under the superiorship of Father Sackert, who was often absent. I had to take care of the home parish. On the evening of Nov. 29th, Father Prost, at that time he was still the general superior in America, arrived to invest me with the habit. However, he left his book behind in Baltimore and made up an investiture ceremony from his memory and from his head, and I was solemnly invested according to that ceremony on the feast of St. Andrew after the High Massachusetts. At that time there was no novice master or novitiate in America, and too much work. Consequently, every day I made, along with the others, the 2 community meditations, examinations of conscience, spiritual reading, visits to the Blessed Sacrament, the Rosary. And that was all. In the week before Easter, the new superior in America, Father Alexander Sivikovich, came 150 to Pittsburgh with Father Oleg and Frater Fay. 151 Father Prost went to Baltimore for a time and returned to Pittsburgh, where he was local superior for a while after Father Alexander left. In the middle 152 of May, 1841. I was supposed to go to Baltimore to begin my novitiate there. However, when I first arrived there on the 21st with Frater Fay and Brother Wenceslaus, Fathers Alexander Rumpier, Cartuvals, along with several brothers, lived there in such cramped quarters that in a few days I received the order to go to New York and help Father Nicholas Balais OSB in St. Nicholas on 2nd Street. This lasted 14 days. Then the order came for me to go to Rochester to make at least some kind of a novitiate under the guidance of Father Chinhens. However, I was hardly there when a letter came to him telling him to return to Norwalk in Ohio, where a certain 153 Father Ferrani had started a schism. As a result, I was alone for 2 months with Brother Louis 154 until Fathers Sandrel and Prost came from Pittsburgh and Buffalo towards the end of July. Because Father Pax in Buffalo was sick, I was sent there to help him. He too would have liked to give the Buffalo parish over to the congregation. However, Bishop Hughes was not in favor of this, and Father Alexander appeared unwilling to compromise himself since he did not have the corresponding faculties for this from Vienna. When Father Pax was restored to health, I was recalled to Rochester on Sept. 9th, 1841, and stayed there only a few days. The reason was that Father Chinhens had too much work in Ohio and I was due to help him. So on Sept. 16th, I went to Norwalk and took care of St. Alphonsus parish while Father Chinhens was practically always traveling, making the rounds of the missions of the scattered Germans in northern Ohio. About the middle of November, 1841, Father Alexander ordered me to set out for Baltimore to make my novitiate there. On the way 15, he allowed me to give missions here and there. Under continual downpours, traveling in an open stagecoach, I arrived on November 17th and at Canton on the 19th. Here I met Bishop Purcell of Cincinnati with his Vicar General, Father Henny, 16, on visitation. Since the rumor was then widespread that our congregation in America was near dissolution, they both extended to me a very pressing 161 invitation to go to Cincinnati, when I declined. I was asked to visit the German parish in Randolph, where one of the factions had burned down the church 3 years before, and where, because of this, there was no priest there since. I stayed there about 10 days, and although the weather was very cold, practically all came to church every day, and all, almost without exception, received the Holy Sacraments. On the trip to Wheeling, I became sick on the stagecoach and stayed 2 days in a house on the way about 10 miles from Steubenville. Oh, the people there, Americans without any particular religion, nursed me with the greatest care and without taking a penny. In Steubenville, I stayed over Sunday with the few Germans whom I had already visited many times from Pittsburgh. I then traveled to 163 Baltimore by way of Wheeling and Cumberland, arriving there on the Feast of Mary's Immaculate Conception deck, 8th. At that time, the entire journey had to be made by stagecoach as far as Frederick MD.J. It was only from there that one could go by railroad. 164. Here in Baltimore, the fathers had already moved to St. James because they were in the process of tearing down St. John's and the small adjoining house. I made the novitiate then with Father 165 Bear. Every day we made the daily exercises as far 166 as we knew them, being for the care of souls, which was not heavy then. Fathers Alexander, Rumpier, and Fay were more than enough. This setup did not 167 last long. After making the spiritual exercises for 14 days, I made my vows in the hands of Father Alexander on the 16th of January, 1842, in St. James Church, Baltimore. Thus my novitiate 16 was ended. Father Rumpier went to New York, Father Bear to Rochester, and Father Alexander to Europe. Consequently, Father Fay, the superior, and I cared for the whole parish. The number of school children, 169 boys and girls, was never greater than 90. I was present when Canon Salzbacher of Vienna, with the permission of Archbishop Eccleston, laid the foundation stone of the present St. Alphonsus Church on May 1st, 1842. As a rule, the care of the stations out in the country came to me. We took care of Cumberland, Harper's Ferry, Martinsburg, Richmond, Frederick, York, Columbia, Strasburg, Shrewsbury regularly, and of many other places occasional on the 5th of March, 1844. Father Alexander made me superior of our house in Pittsburgh, where Father Cartivals had laid the foundation stone for St. Philomena's Church the previous Corpus Christi, and had begun the building. Arthur Fay had come 12 to Pittsburgh to take his place, but he only stayed until the 1st of March. In Pittsburgh I lived with 15 fathers: Chenhens, Muller, Cronenberg, and Schaeffler, Atz, and Silos. Only 2 or 3 of 14. These were home regularly at a time. For the most part, one was occupied with the building of the church until January 25th, 1847, when Father Sackert called me to Baltimore because of a prolonged illness. On the occasion of the visitation by Father de Held. He had been made the superior general in America. From then on I remained mostly in Baltimore. On the 9th of February, 1847, the letter arrived in which Father de Held, provincial of the Congregation of the Most Holy Redeemer in Belgium, named me his vicar. I held this office until the arrival of the present provincial, Father Bernard Hafkenscheid. On April 1st, 1851, I was installed as the first rector of St. Alphonsus Community in Baltimore. 179. On February 1st, 1852, His Holiness Pope Pius IX named me Bishop of Philadelphia. On the evening of the Feast of St. Joseph, the Archbishop of Baltimore, Dr. Kenrick, received the papal bull, and he brought 10 to the house the next day. The Philadelphia Years and the Cause of Canonization. The autobiography of John Neumann covers his life up to the time when he became Bishop of Philadelphia. At the end of the autobiography we read, on February 1st, 1852, His Holiness Pius IX named me Bishop of Philadelphia. Tomorrow, on March 28th, my birthday, that is Passion Sunday this year, 1852, if nothing happens in the meantime, I will be consecrated in St. Alphonsus Church. His episcopal ordination. Archbishop Francis Patrick Kenrick of Baltimore played the leading role in the promotion of Neumann as Bishop of Philadelphia. Before going to Baltimore in 1851, he was Bishop of Philadelphia. He had known Neumann previously. In Baltimore, he used to take the short walk to St. Alphonsus to go to confession to Neumann and to seek spiritual direction from a truly holy priest. He came to know Neumann and see at firsthand his zeal, learning, and holiness. As Archbishop, Kenrick had to take the lead in arranging for a bishop in one of his suffragan sees. He found that man in John Neumann. The views of other archbishops and bishops were sought. All agreed that Neumann was endowed with the necessary learning and holiness. Not all agreed that Neumann, a foreign-born, was the man for the outstanding See of Philadelphia. In the official list of 3 candidates that he sent to Rome, Kenrick put Neumann's name second. This was in deference to views expressed by some of his fellow bishops. In letters to Rome in which he expressed privately his personal opinion, he said that Neumann was the most worthy of the 3, and that his name should be first. When the appointment of Neumann came through, Kenrick could tell his brother, Archbishop Peter Richard Kenrick of St. Louis, I wish without delay to make you a partner of my joy. The Pope named John Neumann, a very holy man, to be my successor in the See of Philadelphia. When Neumann heard about the rumor that his name had been proposed, he was terrified. He wrote to his superiors in Europe to do all that they could to prevent the appointment. Despite the reports of his confreres, the cardinals decided to petition the Pope to name John Neumann for the see. On February 1, Pius IX appointed Neumann the new Bishop of Philadelphia. He dispensed him from his redemptorist vow of poverty that obliged him to refuse such a dignity. He made him bishop under obedience without any possibility of appeal. How Neumann first found out he was bishop makes an interesting story. When Kenric got the news from Rome, he walked to St. Alphonsus. Finding Neumann out, he left his own archiepiscopal cross and ring on no man's desk. Neumann got the message. In a letter to his family, he says, "I knew indeed what that meant, and when I visited him the next day, Kenric let me read the letter." Because the first plenary council of Baltimore was to be held in May, Rome was anxious that Neumann be ordained bishop as soon as possible. The archbishop set the date for Passion Sunday, March 28th, and left the other arrangements in the hands of Father Bernard Hafkenscheid, the Redemptorist provincial. Besides Archbishop Kenric, Bishop Bernardo O'Reilly of Hartford took part in the ordination of his earlier co-worker and friend. On his way to Buffalo, after being ordained by Bishop Du Bois as a diocesan priest of New York in 1836, Neumann stopped off at Rochester, where Father O'Reilly's pastor of St. Patrick's, the only church. There in the Irish church, Neumann made use of his priestly faculties for the first time as he ministered to Father O'Reilly's German parishioners. The bond of friendship remained warm through the years. With the diocesan seminarians and the Redemptorist novices and seminarians doing the singing, the parish ironers at St. Alphonsus witnessed the beautiful liturgical ceremony of the episcopal ordination of their pastor. It took place on his 41st birthday, and he chose as his episcopal motto the words, "Passion of Christ, strengthen me." The Diocese of Philadelphia, accompanied by Father Hafkenscheid, other Redemptorists, along with priests from Philadelphia, Neumann made a very quiet entrance into his diocese on Tuesday, March 30th, 1852. Probably at the suggestion of Father Edward Saurin, the plans for a large reception with a parade were called off. With the money saved in this way, plans were made to build a new school. This delighted Neumann, the retiring man with a driving zeal for schools. A group of priests greeted him at the station. Neumann said to them, "Oh, how I thank you for this quiet but cordial welcome. It was just what I wanted." Later, he met the people when they crowded St. John's, the pro-cathedral. Neumann had entered his diocese. The vast diocese of 35,000 square miles took in all eastern Pennsylvania, the state of Delaware, and the section of New Jersey from Trenton to Cape May. The Diocese of Neumann, in 1852, is now the present Archdiocese of Philadelphia, along with dioceses of Trenton, Camden, Wilmington, Harrisburg, and Allentown, and part of Altoona, Johnstown. Over 1 million people lived there, of whom were Catholics. The city of Philadelphia had a population of 400,000. Philadelphia and its environs numbered 90,000 Catholics. The diocese had 92 churches, 8 chapels, 101 priests, 43 seminarians, 2 colleges, 6 academies for girls, and 7 charitable institutions. Besides the group of diocesan priests, he had the Augustinians, Jesuits, Vincentians, and Redemptorists. The diocese had its own seminary. The Madams of the Sacred Heart, the Visitation Sisters, and the Sisters of St. Joseph conducted academies for girls. There were 3 colleges: St. Joseph's conducted by the Jesuits, Villanova by the Augustinians, and St. Mary's in Wilmington, founded by Father Patrick Raleigh. The diocese was provided with a hospital conducted by the Sisters of St. Joseph, a house of the Good Shepherd, 3 homes for orphans, and a home for widows conducted by the Sisters of Charity and the Sisters of St. Joseph. Neumann's task was to build up on Kenric's foundation. Neumann had to build up in changing circumstances. While the city of Philadelphia continued to grow and grow, places like Wilmington, Chester, Reading, York, Columbia, Easton, and Scranton were seeing the growth of Catholic clusters. One still must reckon with the remote and outlying settlements where Catholics lived miles apart. The big change during these years was the tremendous influx of immigrants from Europe: Irish, Germans, and then Italians. Some got no further than Philadelphia, where they began to border on the neighborhoods of the wealthy and long-established Catholic families. Others found their way throughout the diocese. There is tended to settle in the mining districts of Scranton, Ilksar and Pottsville in the northeast. The Germans gravitated to the farming districts of York, Lancaster and Reading in the south and west. For the most part, they were poor and on the lowest rung of the social ladder. Ever so many could not speak English, or they spoke it with an accent. Their ways and manners were not American. They tended to live in enclaves. The American nativists looked upon them with suspicion and hostility. They needed and received special pastoral care from their bishop. This vast diocese called for a staggering schedule of work. Neumann obviously was not one who shrank from work. As will be seen, he worked himself not only to the bone but to an early death. He did have a longing to be a truly apostolic bishop, and that longing was frustrated by the inability of one man to cover that vast territory and do justice to his demanding ideals. This is why Neumann hoped to see the diocese divided. Even when the Diocese of Newark was created in 1853, and 9,000 square miles were removed from his jurisdiction, he still had a diocese that extended 160 miles from north to south and 150 miles from east to west. Neumann's theme of these early years is seen in the words, "For my part, it is my sincere wish that the diocese might be made as small as possible." After the experience of 3 years, Neumann acted on his plan. At the 8th Provincial Council of Baltimore in 1855, he proposed that the diocese be divided and that a new diocese be set up in Pottsville. He also declared his willingness to take the poorer diocese of Pottsville. In a later session, a proposal was made to set up a diocese at Wilmington, North Carolina. In his letter to Rome, Neumann spoke of his offer to go to Pottsville and then added, "I would prefer the poorest diocese, namely Wilmington, North Carolina." Basically, the move is explained by the reasons already given. Other reasons entered into his decision. Neumann, the foreign-born, did not feel completely at ease in the urbane society of such an important see as Philadelphia. He truly loved mission work out in the country and delighted in the simplicity of country life and people. He was groaning under the financial burden of creating parishes and building churches and schools by the hundreds. To this was added the worry of carrying on the construction of the cathedral begun under his predecessor. Although finances were not his forte, one does not hear that the diocese was on the point of bankruptcy. Actually, the wonder is how he carried on all that building program and found money to keep it going. There was also a certain amount of clerical unrest over some aspects of his regime, but one cannot speak of a general discontent. It was Archbishop Kenrick who suggested that the diocese be not divided, that Neumann remain in Philadelphia, where he shines by his distinguished gifts, his piety, zeal, and holiness of life, and that he be given a coadjutor who knew how to handle temporal matters. This was the solution adopted by Rome when in December 1856, 9 cardinals proposed James Frederick Wood as the coadjutor bishop. The coming of Bishop Wood was a help for Neumann and the diocese. Bishop Neumann put him in charge of the finances. He also put him in charge of the ongoing construction of the cathedral. Knowing that Bishop Wood was on hand, Neumann could go out, with peace of mind, on long visitations of the country districts of the diocese. Despite these good points, things were not working out well in Philadelphia. The main difficulty centered around Wood's understanding or misreading of the mind of Rome in appointing him coadjutor to the Bishop of Philadelphia. He thought that Neumann was meant to resign and hand the diocese over to him. Actually, Neumann had proposed to have the diocese divided. He had volunteered to go to a poorer and smaller diocese. Neumann never offered to resign the episcopate. He did not think that he had a valid, canonical reason to do so. In his own words, "To give up the episcopal career never entered my mind." One can see the tension breaking forth in Neumann's proposal at the 9th Provincial Council of Baltimore in 1858. He proposed that Philadelphia be divided, that a see be erected at Easton, that he be given the poorer diocese of Easton, and that Wood get Philadelphia. Rome's answer was that the matter would be decided at the next national or plenary council. Long before that, Neumann died, and Bishop Wood, the coadjutor, automatically became the Bishop of Philadelphia. Spiritual growth. It is possible to speak of the style of a bishop as he cares for his diocese. Neumann's style was personal contact. The very morning after his arrival, and for many a morning after that, he was out visiting the parishes and institutions of the city, meeting the priests, the sisters, and the laity. His pastoral zeal brought him to the prison to visit the Skrupinski brothers. Condemned to be hanged for the murder of a boy, they had refused to make their peace with God. Neumann won them over, and they agreed to see the priest that he sent them shortly before they went to their deaths. There is an eloquent memento of that visit in the Neumann Museum at St. Peters, Philadelphia, the noose and the black mask used in executions, a gift from the Moyamensing prison. Neumann himself has left us a rich record of his style of personal contact during his 8 years as bishop. This is his visitation record, a record of his travels through the vast expanse of his diocese. Like St. Paul, he was in journeyings often. Even as early as September of his first year, he had visited more than half his diocese. Often he was on the road from 6 to 10 weeks at a time. He covered the populous centers every year, the more remote ones every 2 years. These were, of course, canonical visitations in which he carried out the prescriptions of canon law and examined the registers of baptisms, confirmations, marriages and deaths, studied the finances and the legal status of church property, and inspected the condition of the church and the cemetery. These journeys were also confirmation tours. He would spare no pains to administer it. Once he traveled the 25 steep miles from Belafonte to the remote out mission at Snowshoe to administer it to one child. Neumann always stressed the importance of Catholics being well instructed. He always gave 2 special instructions. If he found someone unprepared, Neumann would himself first instruct the child and then confirm him. In a special way, each stop was a pastoral visit, a parish renewal with spiritual exercises for 3 or 4 days. Neumann met the priests and the people, celebrated parish masses and preached. He spent hours hearing confessions, and there were thousands waiting for someone who could speak their language. Neumann's native language was German. He could handle Czech and other cognate languages. He mastered English, French, Italian, and Spanish. Neumann came across some Irish, mostly from the west of Ireland, who did not speak English. He set himself to the task of learning enough Gaelic to be able to hear their confessions. The story is told that one woman, on coming out of the confessional, exclaimed in her overflowing happiness, "Thanks be to God, we now have an Irish bishop in his concern for the sick, the bedridden, the elderly and the infirm who could not get to church." Neumann was an apostle of masses. On his visitations, he carried along a portable altar to be ready to say mass in their homes and gladden them with the blessings of the sacraments. Not every place he visited was a parish with a church. For groups like this, he selected a residence and named someone to gather the people, read the gospel and other spiritual readings, and recite the rosary. It was a taxing and exhausting schedule. The Eucharistic fast was different in those days. Often it was 1 o'clock before he had breakfast. Despite the rigors of the work, Neumann loved these visits. He felt at home with the poor and the simple country people. Kenrick could well tell Rome that he travels throughout the diocese like a shining light, and with indefatigable labor promotes the piety of the people. The visitation tours occasioned projects for the growth of Christian life in the diocese. In 1853, Neumann began the 40 hours devotion on the Feast of Corpus Christi in the Church of St. Philip Neri. The 40 hours devotion was known 3 centuries before Neumann's time. It had been held occasionally in Philadelphia before 1853. What Neumann did was to inaugurate it on a diocesan level. A schedule was made calling for the devotion to be held in designated churches so as to cover the entire year. Neumann gave great edification by the way he joined in these devotions whenever possible. And to Neumann, the 40 hours was not merely the pious practice of making visits. To him, it was the way of seeing that Catholic life in Philadelphia was rooted in the Eucharist. It was a parish mission on a small scale. It involved deeper instruction in Christian teaching by sermons, the frequentation of the sacraments, Mass and visits. When Neumann was a diocesan priest of New York, he was greatly impressed by the fervor which the introduction of the confraternity of Mount Carmel had produced in the parish conducted by the Redemptorist, Father Joseph Prost. As bishop, he continued to foster confraternities as means of developing the spiritual life of the people. We hear of the confraternity of the Blessed Sacrament inaugurated by Neumann, of Jesus and Mary, of the Scapular, of the Rosary, of the Immaculate Conception. The Society of St. Vincent de Paul sees love for the poor and the needy as the overflow of one's Christian life. The year before Neumann arrived as bishop, there was one conference of this society at St. Joseph's. Neumann encouraged the growth of the society, and when he died there were 12 conferences in the diocese, along with confraternities. Neumann encouraged Lenten devotions and missions. The Lenten devotions were held twice a week. The first night was devoted to the Stations of the Cross. A sermon and benediction were given on the second. He was delighted to have the Redemptorists and the Jesuits for missions. For the Cathedral Mission of 1858, Neumann joined his fellow Redemptorists in the work. Neumann says that during the visitation of the diocese he had the consolation of witnessing the happy fruit produced by missions. His one regret is that there are not more religious here to conduct them. Neumann also encouraged the men and women religious in their life of holiness. He also had a deep awareness of the work they were doing for the spiritual buildup of the diocese. He himself became a founder of a new congregation, the Congregation of the Philadelphia Sisters of the Third Order of St. Francis. He was thinking of a congregation to care for the sick and orphans. In his ad limina visit to the Pope in 1854, Pius IX suggested that he found his own, an order of St. Francis. Father John Hes Paline, a Redemptorist at St. Peter's, was the spiritual director of 3 women who desired to become a religious community in the Franciscan spirit. On April 9, 1855, Neumann invested Mrs. Anna Bachmann, a widow Barbara Hall, her sister and Anna Dorn with their religious habit. A year later they made their vows in the bishop's chapel after he had introduced them to the religious life and given them a rule. Under Neumann they cared for the sick, and then they also took on teaching work. The bishop was mindful of the growth of his priests in holiness. He pointed out to them the bond between liturgy and holiness. Each year he arranged a retreat for them and a special retreat master. He himself gave the retreat in 1853, and it was a source of joy to him. Because of the link between learning and holiness, he arranged conferences on theological topics 4 times a year. He would make it a point to be present. Because the diocese was vast and all could not come to Philadelphia, he had regional meetings set up. Kenrick tells us that there was a close bond between Neumann and his priests, and especially between him and those he ordained. He showed concern for them not only in life but also in death. He founded the Association for Deceased Clergymen. Each priest obliged himself to say 2 masses when one of his fellow priests died. External expansion. But Amori. In 1852, the Catholic population of the diocese was 170,000, despite the fact that the New Jersey territory became part of the Diocese of Newark in 1853, the population rose to 175,000. The increase came from births, immigration, and conversions. With the years, the Catholic population continued to grow. By 1858, the number reached 250,000, and that number remained a constant in the reports and almanacs while Neumann lived. All this increase called for new churches and parishes. Neumann's 8 years saw phenomenal growth. From his report to Rome in 1854, he had completed 6 churches begun under Kenrick, rebuilt 6 others, and built 30. The following year, he informed Rome that, with regard to the number of churches, Philadelphia is larger than any other diocese or archdiocese. That was only the halfway mark in his episcopate. When he died, his era saw almost 80 new churches. Immigration complicated the work, calling for special parishes for those who could not speak English. Most of these were German. However, under Neumann, the first Italian parish was created. At first, he gave them the use of the chapel in his residence. Shortly after that, he bought them an old Methodist church building, and this became the beginning of the parish of St. Mary Magdalene de Pazzi, probably the first Italian national parish. All these new parishes and churches called for more priests. He needed many more than the 101 diocesan priests that he had in 1852. For the English-speaking Catholics, he was fortunate. Here he was helped with priests from Ireland, or seminarians, who would complete their studies in the seminary of the diocese. His pressing problem was German-speaking priests. Appeals were sent to Europe. The response was meager. Neumann soon realized that help from Europe was not adequate. The Church in the United States would have to solve its own problems and find home remedies for its needs. The answer was native vocations. Neumann's answer to this was to foster vocations from youth on and to start a minor or preparatory seminary. In 1856, Neumann had 20 young students at St. Charles Preparatory Seminary in Ellicott City, Maryland. He wanted one closer to home, in the diocese. In September 1859, he opened his own minor seminary, Aglin Riddle, with a class of 26. He saw the major and the minor seminary as a unit. He says this institution, in connection with our theological seminary of St. Charles Borromeo, will, with the blessing of God and our cooperation, supply us with pious and learned priests to aid in the fulfillment of our pastoral duties. What he said proved to be true down the years. Meanwhile, Neumann was happy to see the growth in major seminarians. There were 36 in 1852, 58 in 1859. The number of priests grew to 170. For parochial work, he was helped not only by the Augustinians, Jesuits and Redemptorists, but also by two other orders that came into the diocese in the Neumann years: the Benedictines, who took over the remote parish at Bellefonte with its many widely scattered missions, and the conventual Franciscans, who took charge of St. Alphonsus and acted as spiritual directors for the congregation of the Philadelphia Sisters of the Third Order of St. Francis. In his letters to his sister Joan, who joined the Sisters of Mercy of St. Charles Borromeo in Prague, where she was known as Mother Caroline, Neumann speaks of bringing the order to Philadelphia, where it would conduct a hospital and an orphanage. This never materialized. At his death, Neumann had only one hospital saint, Joseph's, that the Sisters of St. Joseph gave over to the Sisters of Charity in 1859. His love for the sick and his visits to the hospital, making the rounds of the patients, is vividly described by Mother Saint John Fournier. Although Neumann was unable to add another hospital to the diocese, he had the happiness of seeing the order he founded dedicate itself to the care of the sick by visiting them in their homes. This was the beginning of their later hospital work. He did succeed in adding another home for orphans to the diocese. St. Vincent's Tacony. This is an overflow of Neumann's love of children. With them he was like a father. This was largely, but not exclusively, for Germans. He was very concerned about children of immigrants who lost their parents. He was also concerned with saving their Catholic faith and practice by having them raised under Catholic auspices. Catholic education. The name of John Neumann will always hold a high place in the history of Catholic education. With his strong conviction about education and religion, he promoted parochial schools with unremitting zeal. As a diocesan priest of New York, he established schools in his country missions in the Buffalo area. So important was this work to him that he himself acted as teacher for some months after he had to fire the school teacher because of his misconduct. As a Redemptorist, he continued this work. When the School Sisters of Notre Dame arrived here in 1847, he not only helped them to get established, but he was fortunate to get them to take over the schools in the Redemptorist parishes in Baltimore, Buffalo, and Philadelphia. With such a background, it is obvious that Neumann would be a zealous promoter of parochial schools. Scarcely was he in his see when two celebrated meetings took place in April that considered the problem of parochial schools, and that set up the Diocesan Board of Education. The bishop was the president of the board that was made up of the pastor and two laymen from each parish. Neumann's drive for parish schools was started. Many things fostered his program. One thinks of the encouragement given to Catholic education by the First Plenary Council, May 1852. A series of eloquent lectures helped the cause. The zeal of the pastors was a great help. The dedication of the teachers also furthered the work. Neumann always was mindful of the sacrifice which the good people are willing to make. No one can fail to mention Neumann's own untiring efforts. As a realist, he could tell the people whatever difficulties may at first attend, and even obstruct, this most desirable undertaking will be gradually overcome by mutual goodwill and cooperation. With Neumann's coming in 1852, schools that were closed were reopened, and new schools began to be built in parish after parish. This work became known far and wide, and James McMaster wrote a glowing report on Philadelphia's fresh spring. In a letter of 1853, Neumann told his father that the number of children in parochial schools had increased from 500 to 5,000. He also told him that before another year had passed, he hoped to have 10,000. His estimate was not far off the mark. In his report to the Pope in 1854, he stated that he had 34 parochial schools with an enrollment of almost 9,000. All during his years, school after school was erected. Schools were erected in the cities and in the country districts. Furthermore, many a far-flung outpost in Pennsylvania and Delaware could boast of a parochial school. In 1858, Neumann backed the founding of a school for blacks who were gathered in the neighborhood of St. Joseph's and cared for by the Jesuits, Fathers Barbelin and Lilly. In their gratitude, some of these children made the long walk to St. Peter's to be present at the funeral of the bishop who showed such concern for them. In promoting schools, Neumann insisted on good buildings and good accommodations. He also was concerned with qualified and capable teachers. Here he was helped by religious orders that were in the diocese before he came: the Visitation Sisters, who left in 1852, the Madams of the Sacred Heart, the Sisters of the Good Shepherd of Charity of St. Joseph, the School Sisters of Notre Dame, and the Christian Brothers. During his years, he succeeded in bringing in other orders: the Sisters of the Holy Cross, of Notre Dame de Namur, the Sisters Servants of the Immaculate Heart. Furthermore, it was not long before his own order, the Philadelphia Sisters of St. Francis, was engaged in this work. He also introduced the Brothers of the Holy Cross. In a short survey like this, only a passing mention can be made of Neumann's interest in and encouragement of the work of education in the private academies for girls conducted by various religious orders. The same applies to the 4 Catholic colleges: St. Mary's College in Wilmington, founded by Father Patrick Reilly; St. Joseph's College in St. Joseph's, Susquehanna County, founded by Father Vincent O. I. Ely; Villanova College, that was conducted by the Augustinians; and St. Joseph's College, the college in the city of Philadelphia, that was conducted by the Jesuits. Mention should also be made of Neumann's work in the field of clerical education. Philadelphia had its own seminary, St. Charles Borromeo. On coming into the diocese, Neumann faced a serious seminary crisis. The seminary was conducted by the Vincentians. In 1852, they decided that they had to give it up because too many of their men were being made bishops, including Father Thaddeus Amat, the rector of St. Charles. Neumann would have liked to get another religious order to take care of the seminary, but he was unable. The seminary meant so much to him that, despite his lack of priests, he decided to keep the seminary open and have it conducted by the diocesan clergy. It has remained with them to this day. As one who received an excellent clerical education, Neumann was anxious to see that his seminarians were properly trained. When not away on visitation, he spent some time there every day, giving instructions in pastoral theology. Despite his need for priests in the ministry, every seminarian had to devote 2 years to philosophy and 4 to theology. Neumann introduced courses in church history, liturgy, chant, and sacred eloquence. The students at St. Charles were fortunate in using the facilities of St. Joseph's College for courses in history and science, diocesan programs and regulations. The pastoral letters of a bishop are a good source for learning about the programs and projects a bishop has for his diocese. The section on education has shown the carrying out of the bishop's plans in the pastoral on education. Hardly was Neumann in the diocese when he sent out his first pastoral letter, and also a circular to the clergy dealing with the building of the cathedral that was begun under Archbishop Kenrick in 1846. He had to champion a cause for which there was no money left when he took over the diocese. Neumann championed the cause, collected money, devised various ways for gathering more money when the funds went low. The progress was very slow and discouraging. Neumann told himself that what is to last long must be built slowly. He adopted the policy of working on it only when he had money at hand. He also appreciated the plight of the people who were building, paying for, and supporting their own parish churches and schools. Before he died, Neumann had the consolation of seeing the exterior completed and the roof finished. The ceremony of placing the golden cross on the dome took place on September 14, 1859. In 1854 and 1855, Neumann issued 2 pastorals on Mary and her Immaculate Conception. Neumann gave an explanation of the doctrine, another instance of his desire to have Catholics firmly grounded in their faith. He also encouraged devotion to Mary as part and parcel of life in Christ. Mention has already been made of the fact that Neumann opened a preparatory seminary for youths studying for the priesthood. The Pastoral of 1859 explains to the people what an institution like that is. He stressed the importance of the parental roof and admitted that the guardianship of parents is certainly the best nursery of good Christians. At the same time, he tells them that preparatory seminaries are needed to foster vocations. The youth are trained in learning, live in an atmosphere of prayer where their hearts are prepared for every virtue. Neumann was convinced that vocations could come from the families of the poor. The answer to this was a preparatory seminary in the diocese where their vocations could be fostered and where they could be supported by the diocese. The response of the people was most enthusiastic. That year, the collection for the seminary fund was $11,442, an amount that was 3 times that of the previous years. Neumann's proposal was widely proclaimed and was followed in other dioceses. Neumann's aims for the diocese are also seen in the legislation of the 3 synods held in 1853, 1855, and 1857. Here one sees his desire to have Catholics well instructed in their faith. Regulations were laid down regarding the proper instruction for the sacraments of penance and the Eucharist and matrimony. In places where there was not a parochial school, the pastors were to introduce the Society of Christian Doctrine. Neumann also arranged to have the Society for the Propagation of the Faith introduced into the diocese. Steps were taken for the proper and legal incorporation of church property. In the future, all deeds were to be made out to the bishop and his heirs and assigns of the Roman Catholic congregation of N. Name of parish. The pastors were not to hold church property in their own name. An inventory of all church belongings was to be kept in each parish. Precision was given to the items that constituted the revenue that belonged to the church, and not to the pastor. The records of personal belongings and expenses were to be kept separately. Finally, the synods show us the importance of liturgy in Neumann's diocese. Vespers were to be sung in all the churches of the diocese on Sundays and holy days. No other pious exercise was to take the place of Vespers because the solemn cult of the Church, approved and in vogue for so many centuries, is to be judged as more pleasing to God if Vespers could not be sung because of insufficient numbers. The pastor could have other exercises of piety. Even in this case, the pastor should choose prayers taken from the liturgy or prayers to which the Pope had attached indulgences. Neumann encouraged the participation of the people in the singing of the Mass. It was under him that the first known Kyriale or Book of Chants was published in this country. The death of Bishop Neumann, January 5, 1860. To use his own phrase, Neumann was a sturdy mountain boy. That was the phrase that he would always use when Father Alexander Pax, his friend and co-worker on the Buffalo missions, would check up on the young priest for working too hard. In some ways, the health of the sturdy mountain boy from Prachotets was never the same after a 3-month bout with fever in 1840. In his Redemptorist years, he did have some sick spells in Baltimore and Pittsburgh, the result of his driving schedule. In his years as bishop, 1852 to 1860, he is not known to have had any serious health problem. As a matter of fact, he was constantly on the go, sparing no effort to care for that vast diocese. People marveled at his drive and untiring zeal. They always thought of him as strong and robust, as a man with an iron constitution. It could be said that Neumann had not so much an iron constitution as a will of steel. Furthermore, as one of his contemporaries notes, such labors as he underwent would sooner or later weigh down the strongest constitution. With the dawning of the new year, 1860, Neumann was not a well man. He himself was aware of it, others noticed it. In a letter of January 4th, dealing with affairs of the sisters, servants of the Immaculate Heart, he told Sister Magdalene, "I am not feeling well these last few days, otherwise I might have gone up to see Mother Teresa." Of that same day, the Jesuit, Father Edward Saurin, who was Neumann's former vicar general, tells us, "The last time I visited him, I noticed that he was very unwell. I begged him to let me go and call on the assistance of his physicians, but he answered with a smile and said, 'T will be well enough tomorrow.'" He then goes on to say that Neumann went out the next day and never returned. At the midday meal of January 5th, Neumann went out of his way to keep the conversation light. He did this to hide the fact that he was not feeling well. Shortly after that, Neumann had a visitor. It was his Redemptorist confrere, Father Anthony Urbanchik. He was stopping over in Philadelphia from Pittsburgh on his way to take part in a mission at the Redemptorist Church in New York. At first, Neumann had difficulty recognizing him and focusing on him, even though they were close friends. Urbanchik noticed the glassy look in Neumann's eyes. When Urbanchik asked about his health, Neumann mentioned about not feeling well for some days, and he also spoke about having a strange feeling, a feeling he never felt before. Neumann made little of this, and spoke of an errand he had to do that would take him out into the fresh air. He assured Urbanchik that the fresh air would do him good. Neumann had 2 errands. The first dealt with a deed to some diocesan property that had to be duly registered and notarized. The second was about a chalice and ciborium to be sent to Father Otto Piety, the Benedictine working at Bellefonte, Pennsylvania. After the first errand, Neumann was walking along the north side of Vine Street, going towards 13th Street. Suddenly, Neumann collapsed on the steps of the home of the Quain family. 2 men passing by carried him into the house and laid him on the carpet. After a few deep breaths, Neumann expired. A priest was summoned who anointed him. Bishop Wood also arrived and found life already extinct. It was January 5th, 1860, about 3:30 in the afternoon, when Bishop John Neumann died at the age of 49. The news of the death spread like wildfire with lightning speed. The people were stunned and shocked. Many would not believe their ears and called at the Redemptorists to ask, "Is it true?" The following day, Thursday, was the Feast of Epiphany, and the announcement of his death was made at all the masses. Bishop Wood, who automatically became Bishop of Philadelphia when Neumann died, made the funeral arrangements. The funeral mass would take place on Monday morning, January 9th, in St. John's, the Pro-Cathedral. Neumann's body would then lie in state there all during the day and be buried that evening in one of the outside vaults. Until the services in St. John's, the body would lie in state in the cathedral chapel, the building used for services while the cathedral was being built. One significant change was made. Because Neumann was a Redemptorist, and because he often expressed the desire to be buried with his confreres, permission was given them to bury him in their church, St. Peter's. Consequently, after the Mass at St. John's, the body was brought to St. Peter's on the afternoon of January 9th. The next day after the Mass, again sung by Bishop Wood, the body was interred in the vault in the sanctuary of the lower chapel, where it has remained ever since. No sooner had Neumann died when the Vox Populi, the voice of the people, was heard throughout Philadelphia. The people have a sixth sense for holiness. They recognize a holy person, the genuine article. They proclaim it in ever so many ways. They proclaim it with insistence and persistence until finally the church authorities introduce a person's cause for canonization. The voice of the people was heard in the profound sorrow, the stunned disbelief, and the repeated requests for assurance that the news of his death was true. It was evidenced in crowds at St. John's and St. Peter's, both outside and inside, in the thousands who filled every inch of space along the streets, on the rooftops and at the windows as the procession made its way to St. John's. It was seen in the thousands who jammed the route to St. Peter's to get another look at their bishop when the funeral plans were changed and they learned that there would be another lying in state and burial at St. Peter's. These crowds cannot be explained by the curiosity of people to see the funeral of an important bishop. A contemporary write-up says, "Did we need any evidence of the appreciation in which the distinguished prelate was held by the laity and clergy, as well as by all who knew him? We have certainly witnessed it in the manner in which they collected together, on the occasion of the funeral obsequies, to do honor to his memory, and to attest to the love which they bore him. The voice of the people was manifested in the reverence with which they approached the body, kissed the hand or foot, and applied some object to the body to keep it as a memento or relic. It was seen in the votive offerings of flowers that constantly decorated his grave. Another manifestation of the voice of the people is seen in the conversion of heart that his death occasioned for some. It was a conversion from sin to virtue for others. It was a conversion to a more fervent practice of the Christian life. A very important aspect of the voice of the people is seen in the growth of the Neumann legend. This grew right out of the lives of the people. People began to talk of Neumann from their own experiences. One told this story of Neumann's goodness, generosity, charity, self-sacrifice. One told another story. In this way there emerged a composite picture that portrayed a holy person. The voice of the people is heard most of all in the people who came to his tomb to pray, not for him, but to him. They prayed that he would intercede for them with the Lord. People came on their own and they brought the sick and needy. It was not long before there were reports of reputed cures, prayers answered and favors granted. Neumann was buried at St. Peter's on January 10, 1860. Less than a month later, Father Holzer could say to Father Maron, "Our church has truly become a pilgrimage church. Indeed, everyone looks upon the deceased bishop as a saint." The passing of the years did not reduce the enthusiasm of the people for visiting Neumann's tomb. Reports mounted of cures and favors granted. The people regarded him as a saint and had no doubt that they were praying at the tomb of a saint. Consequently, with the approval of Rome, the cause for the beatification and canonization was begun in 1886. These investigations took place in the Archdiocese of Philadelphia at St. Peter's and in the Diocese of Budweis at Prakatets in the Neumann home. These take place under the bishop, under the ordinary of the place, and that is why this phase is known as the ordinary process. Part of the Philadelphia process was the opening of the tomb and the examination and identification of the body. This was the first in the official exhumations of the body. In 1896, Pope Leo XIII signed the document that authorized the introduction of the cause at Rome. This was the beginning of the apostolic process. This is the first time that such a process was instituted for a person from the United States of America. Here, the test case, the big hurdle, is the decree on the heroicity of virtue. That is, that John Neumann was heroic in the practice of the virtues of faith, hope and charity and the other virtues. Pope Benedict XV issued the decree on Neumann's heroic virtue in 1921. This is a most important document because it describes so clearly what constitutes heroic virtue. It shows that heroicity of virtue does not call for heroics, or the extraordinary and the spectacular. Benedict XV pointed out that heroic holiness consists in fulfilling, with all their daily difficulties, the duties of one's state in life with faith and fidelity, with constancy and perseverance. In the history of holiness, this is a most consoling document. It encourages everyone to find holiness in his own way of life. And this is why the Pope said that Neumann is not merely a model for men, religious and bishops, but for all you are all bound to imitate Venerable Neumann. For beatification, it is necessary to have 2 medically authenticated miraculous cures obtained through the intercession of Bishop Neumann. After the Sacred Congregation of Rites passed on 2 miracles, Pope John XXIII gave his papal approval on February 25, 1963. The first miracle, from 1923, is the cure of Eva Benassi, an 11-year-old girl from the town of Sassuolo near Milan, Italy. One night death was imminent. During the night, all symptoms of peritonitis vanished. The second case, from 1949, involves J. Kent Lenehan, Jr. of Villanova, Pennsylvania. As a result of an automobile accident, he was crushed between the car and a utility pole. His skull was crushed, one eye was almost jarred out of its socket, he was bleeding copiously from ears, nose and mouth. His fever rose to 107 degrees and his pulse was 160. His parents applied a portion of Bishop Neumann's cassock. Within a few hours his fever dropped to 100 and his pulse was nearly normal. His injuries were on their way to complete healing. 5 weeks after the AC accident, he walked unaided from the hospital. Pope John then issued the Tudo Decree, the decree that states that it is now safe to proceed with the beatification. The date set for the beatification was June 23rd. The Pope's sickness and death demanded that it be postponed. Bishop Neumann was beatified by Pope Paul VI on October 13, 1963. Pope Paul observed that God in his goodness had given comfort to the beginning of his pontificate by granting him Blessed John Neumann as his first beatification. After the beatification, various petitions were sent to Rome to continue the process toward even tool canonization. The Redemptorist Superior General, William Gaudreau, sent one in the name of all Neumann's confreres throughout the world. Cardinal Baran of Prague sent one in the name of all Catholics in Czechoslovakia. Another was sent by Cardinal Dopfner of Munich, who made the request in his own name and in the name of 500 priests exiled from Czechoslovakia. Archbishop Kroll, now Cardinal Neumann's successor in Philadelphia, was one of the signers of a petition, including the names of cardinals, archbishops, and bishops from all over the world. Pope Paul gave his approval and the case was officially reopened on January 27, 1966, with a view towards canonization. The completed testimony on 2 alleged miracles was forwarded to Rome. At times in this last phase, Rome dispenses from the necessity of 2 miracles. This applied to Neumann's case. The miracle for the canonization centers around Michael Flanagan. In 1962, when he was 5 years old and living in West Philadelphia, he bruised his shin. Cancer of the bone tissue and marrow developed later. This spread to the lungs and jaws. After a year of intensive suffering, he was blessed with a relic of Bishop Neumann, and within 6 weeks, all traces of cancer disappeared. This case was sent to Rome from the Philadelphia Tribunal in 1971. On December 18, 1975, the medical panel in Rome declared that there was no medical explanation for the case. The Congregation for the Causes of Saints on July 13, 1976, gave its approval to the cause of sainthood for Bishop Neumann. At the solemn consistory, held on December 20, 1976, Pope Paul VI announced that the canonization would take place on June 19, 1977.